When Lacan says abject, little a, is a workable kernel of jouissance, he means that it is, and I quote, the condition of any jouissance whatsoever. Two modes of jouissance in particular seem to intrigue him here in his third Rome discourse. So much so that he assigns each an important place in his new and improved Borromean knot, the one you see on your screen in this lecture, just like the previous lectures in this series. Let's consider each of them in turn. At the intersection of the real and the imaginary, he writes capital J next to capital A, which we often know as other enjoyment, the enjoyment of the other, specifically, the enjoyment of the other sexed feminine. Here, indeed, is feminine enjoyment, beyond the phallic function. Here is the famous not all of feminine enjoyment, well captured in a formula we've been over lots before, which I will now write up here for you to see. It looks like an upside down capital AX next to the phi X with a line over the AX that says not all of her enjoyment is governed by the phallic function. And I'll draw a little line there connecting this so that you know exactly what we're talking about here. This falls within the remit of JA. Here also is impossible enjoyment, enjoyment which is impossible to capture in language, in meaning, in other words, as enunciated knowledge. Hence its placement, and note this, beyond the symbolic. You see, the symbolic is this green ring in the lower right. Note where that J capital A is. That shit is beyond, in excess of the green ring of the symbolic. And now you can start to see some patterns happening here. Meaning beyond the real. Other enjoyment beyond the symbolic. And as we're going to see in this lecture, phallic enjoyment beyond the imaginary. That's what's going on here. Let's take it one step at a time. Looking closely again at that JA for now, feminine enjoyment beyond the phallic function is other enjoyment beyond language, again, in excess of the symbolic, hence where it's placed in the Borromean diagram on your screen. But note how Lacan also characterizes it here. Other enjoyment, marked JA in this diagram, is the jouissance of the body, he tells us, insofar as it is the jouissance of life. It's on page 47 of our reading if you want to go check it out. This JA is jouissance of the body, insofar as it is the jouissance of life. Now notice what's happening here. You've got this other jouissance midway between life, housed in the real, and this core, this image of the body in the imaginary. And Lacan is starting to work that angle. You see, other enjoyment isn't just enjoyment at the intersection of the real and the imaginary, and beyond the symbolic, but also, more precisely, enjoyment at the intersection of life and the body, where representations of the body link up with the more immediate animal experience of being one. In other words, being a body. So that's what's happening here, is you've got other jouissance midway between life and the body, where representations of the body link up with the more immediate animal experience of being a body. which is why Lacan repeatedly calls it in our readings, and I love this part, corporal enjoyment. This is a truly helpful clarification, if you ask me, especially if you think back to what he does and doesn't say about corporality since Seminar 20. Here we see corporal enjoyment, again in that JA. And so I'm going to write it up here on the screen, just so we can have it in front of us. Corporal enjoyment. The second mode of enjoyment, to which Lacan gives pride of place in this updated Baromean diagram, is phallic enjoyment, which most but not all versions of this diagram present as a capital J next to a lowercase phi. Or in the diagram that you see right here in front of you, there's a capital J next to a slightly smaller capital phi. I'll let you sort all this out. We don't need to get into this weed in particular. Here's the important part. It occurs at the intersection of the real and the symbolic, this J phi of phallic enjoyment. But also note once more, this intersection of real and symbolic that Lacan labels phallic enjoyment is also external to the imaginary. This is where he now locates phallic enjoyment. Here is that fallible mode of enjoyment we've discussed at length, which must be for all speaking beings, but also must fail because the oneness and autonomy it promises never quite arrive. Here is that necessary enjoyment, which governs all masculine subjects without exception, which again is precisely why masculine subjects never stop fantasizing about exceptional men. It's at the level of fantasy that we meet the father of the primal horde in all of his big dog formations. So much so that I would suggest you might as well write both of Lacan's formulas for masculine enjoyment here in this field labeled J phi. And once more, I'm going to write it up here just so we can keep it in mind. There's the formula that says there exists someone capable of naysaying the phallic function. Here is the formula for that big dog that masculine subjects never stop fantasizing about. We also, however, here have the formula that reads all masculine enjoyment is governed by the phallic function. I think they both can be dropped right into this arena, this overlapping intersectional exterior to the imaginary zone labeled J phi. What caught my eye here relative to this placement of J phi in the Baromean knot diagram is its anomalous relation to the body's jouissance, to corporal enjoyment. Notice this, phallic enjoyment has an anomalous relation to corporal enjoyment. Phallic enjoyment, Lacan even quips, is an out-of-body experience, or corps in the French, out of body. So check this out. If corporal enjoyment is external to the symbolic, phallic jouissance, phallic enjoyment is external to the imaginary, and thus also corporal enjoyment. I'm not sure I understand what Lacan is getting at here. I don't quite see what's at stake with this or core status of phallic enjoyment. But I like it, and I'm intrigued at what he's doing, and I expect it will become more apparent in Seminar 22, RSI, where this diagram figures largely and throughout. I haven't read Seminar 22. We're going to find out when we get there. So what I would suggest is let's just put a pin in this image of phallic enjoyment beyond the imaginary. Far more intriguing to me, I'd say, is what also seems to surprise Lacan in his lecture, or so he says, and I quote, "The most surprising thing is that the objet A in the diagram separates this jouissance of the body from phallic jouissance." So just to keep things balanced, I'm going to write phallic jouissance up here so that we can have it in mind. I know you know what it is, but we wrote corporal enjoyment with our JA, so why don't we just add our phallic enjoyment down here to our J phi so we can keep it all clear in our heads what exactly we're talking about here. The important part and the surprising part that I find really intriguing here is that little a in between. You see, there's no direct access between corporal enjoyment and phallic enjoyment. They have to pass through that little a. And so the question is, what the fuck is that all about? Between corporal and phallic enjoyment, Lacan's diagram shows, there is no direct line of connection. Their relation, if we can even call it that, is mediated through this abject objet A, and thus effectively differential. Phallic enjoyment and corporal enjoyment have a mediated, brokered, and thus differential relation. Now, recall that these two modes of enjoyment, corporal and phallic, are sexed, and you've really got something popping. Corporal enjoyment is quintessentially feminine, here written as JA, but just as easily formulated with Lacan's major formula for feminine sexuation, the upside-down capital AX next to the capital phi X that says not all of her enjoyment is governed by the phallic function. And check it out. Phallic enjoyment in this model and in Lacan's lecture is quintessentially masculine, here written J phi, but again, just as easily rendered in Lacan's formulas of masculine enjoyment, which is why I've written them on the screen as well. If only we had something equally easy, accessible, and familiar to help us understand the irremediable division between corporal enjoyment sexed feminine and phallic enjoyment sexed masculine. Oh, wait. We do. Here, once more, we have the sexual non-rapport. Namely, the fact that thanks to language use, significant and insignificant alike, shiny sens and shitty petita rattling together, thanks to all of this, there is no such thing as a sexual relationship in the sense of direct, immediate, unifying oneness with another. And again, don't make the sexual relation bit more complicated than it is. There's no such thing as a sexual relationship means there's no such thing as a direct, immediate, unifying, oneifying relation that we can have with anybody else. Why? Because language stands between. Little a here represents that go-between that prevents us from ever having oneness and unification. Here, as ever, Lacan's pretty explicit, and it takes us right to the end of his lecture, but I'd be remiss to leave it unsaid. It's on page 84, and it's just such a sparkling, clear illustration of what's up with the sexual relationship that is no such thing, here symbolized little a. In no case can two bodies make one, however tight they hold each other. I have not gone as far as putting it into my text, but the best we can do in these famous embraces is to say, "Hold me tight." But one does not hold so hard that the other ends up snuffing it, with the result that there is no kind of reduction to one. It is the most absurd joke. Oneness for Lacan is the most absurd joke. What then is the precise significance of this abject objet that Lacan places between corporal enjoyment sexed feminine and phallic enjoyment sexed masculine? That little italicized A serves multiple purposes in this new and improved Borromean diagram. But in this case, Lacan says it functions as an object of surplus enjoyment, much as it also does, not coincidentally, in the master's discourse, namely the discourse premised on the exploitation of others in service to selves who can't admit their own subjectivity. You want to know the master's discourse in a nutshell? There it is. It's premised on the exploitation of others in service to selves who cannot admit their own barred subjectivity. And if that's not clue enough to the function of that little a relative to corporal and phallic enjoyment, I don't know what is. Even so, here's another clue. Which of Lacan's 4 formulas of sexuation do we have yet to write on the board? Which of the 4 has not shown up yet? Why, it's the other feminine formula, written as a capital backwards-looking EX with a line over the top, next to a capital Phi-X with a line over the top. And because we're working this in the spirit of clarity, coherence, and accessibility, I'm going to write it up here once more. Here is the missing, up to this point, 4th formula, the second for feminine enjoyment. And I assign it to this middle place between corporal enjoyment and phallic enjoyment, in this little abject objet that functions as something for surplus enjoyment. So we now have to add that as well. And now do you see how it's starting to shape up? The J capital A signifies corporal enjoyment. The J Phi signifies phallic enjoyment. And that little a is the place for surplus enjoyment. Lacan's pretty clear on this. It's kind of all over the place in his 3rd Rome discourse. But if you read it carefully, this is how it shakes out. This other formula for feminine enjoyment, the backwards EX formula, is one that we've been over lots, and you know how to read it. It goes something like this. Look as hard as you want. You can't find any feminine subjects who aren't a little to a lot governed by the phallic function. As I'm sure you'll recall here, the logic is pretty damn simple, despite all of Lacan's tortured presentations of this point. If 100% of masculine enjoyment is governed by the phallic function, 1 to 99% of feminine enjoyment is so governed. Which is why I say that some, but not all, feminine enjoyment is governed by the phallic function. And there you have both of the formulas coming together. The backwards EX formula for feminine enjoyment is our sum, and the not all is represented by the upside down capital AX formula. Some but not all feminine enjoyment is governed by the phallic function. Now, it's a little more complicated than that, as you well know, because we now have to ask, where's the third in all of this? We'll come to that in a bit, but for now, just hold this together as the feminine subject, the subject sexuated feminine. My point is this, and it's one you've probably heard me make before. There is always at least 1% of feminine enjoyment that exceeds the phallic function, and typically much more than 1%. And that's part of the issue here. Some, but not all, is governed by the phallic function. If 1 to 99% is so governed, that means that there is at least 1% that is not. This, if you ask me, is what it means to enjoy as a feminine subject. Some of your enjoyment will inevitably be governed by the phallic function. Here again is Lacan's first formula for feminine enjoyment. But not all of your enjoyment's gonna be so governed. Here is the second formula. And what I'm suggesting here is that we can and should map these aspects of feminine enjoyment onto Lacan's flashy new Baromean diagram in his third Rome discourse. So here it is again, running it through, this time all at once. J capital A equals feminine enjoyment beyond the phallic function. Here we write that major not all formula. And here again, we now locate corporal enjoyment beyond the symbolic, the kind of enjoyment Lacan reserves for mystics as well, you'll recall, and he includes himself in this list of mystics. How about that little a in between? This is the part of feminine enjoyment that is governed by the phallic function. Here is that 1 to 99% I just mentioned, and with it Lacan's other formula of feminine sexuation, the backwards EX form. Little detour, trust me, it's worth it. Note also with regard to this little a that at this point we now enter the field of language use. Little a has some real, little a is in the imaginary, but with little a we see the feminine subject as a mode of enjoyment entering the field of language use, namely the symbolic. The parts of feminine enjoyment captured in the little a between corporal and phallic enjoyment, let me be clear about this. They are mediated through language, passing through the defiles of the signifier, and thus susceptible to logics of speech, desire, fantasy, and you know where I'm headed with this, surplus enjoyment. Think tits, legs, lips, and assholes. It's a long list. And it goes on. Which is why it makes sense to mark the shift from JA to little a as a shift from corporal enjoyment to surplus enjoyment, from the parts of feminine enjoyment that exceed the social to the parts of feminine enjoyment captured therein, linguistified, symbolized, and thus fundamentally thingified, reified, Lord, hear me, objectified. Motherfuckers, I'm talking about the part of her that is commodified and packaged for consumption. So it goes for feminine subjects. They are always corporalities and commodities at the same time, and never one without also being the other. and thus the irremediable division between the two as well. What the masculine subject denies, in other words, the feminine subject cannot ignore. Life lived in triplicate. If you can hold all this in mind with me, and I'm trying to hold it all in mind myself, I think we can now ask about the relation of this little a to that J phi in Lacan's diagram. Remember, J phi here equals phallic enjoyment, specifically phallic enjoyment sexed masculine. And I would add once more, phallic enjoyment sexed masculine and tinged with delusions of mastery. Time is short, so I'm going to try and cut right to it. For whom is some but not all of the feminized subject an object of surplus enjoyment? For whom is some but not all of her a commodity to be bought and sold, had and held till death do they barf? The masculine subject. In the feminine subject, the masculine subject sees a partner who allows themselves to be reduced to a part for his surplus enjoyment, and beyond this, his phallic enjoyment more broadly. Now, as the father of a 10-year-old, I realize increasingly what I've known for a long time, but boy, do I realize it now. This is a touchy subject, and one that gets my hackles up, motherfucker, let me tell you. I realize this is some touchy business, and I hesitate to use the word allows here, but it captures much of what sexuation entails for Lacan. To be sexuated masculine is to be taught that you're nothing without having a partner reduced to parts in narcissistic service to your own feelings of wholeness. You got all that? Fuck yeah, you got to have all that. That's what it means to be sexuated masculine. It's to be taught that you're nothing without having a partner reduced to parts, each of which is in narcissistic service to your own feelings of wholeness. You see, phallic enjoyment is never anything more than this part-whole gambit. A partner reduced to parts in order to make the masculine subject feel whole. This is what is at stake in phallic enjoyment. What about the flip side of this proverbial coin? To be sexed feminine is to be taught that you're nothing without being just this for masculine subjects. Parts in service to their wholeness. Hence, the saying we've been scaling up in our recent series. Women are taught to be what men are taught to have. I'm not saying I like this shit. I'm telling you this is what heteronormativity looks like. And lest you have any inkling that this is somehow a balanced regime of being and having, let me just remind you and be crystal clear about this balance. It is toxic as hell and downright misogynist. From the masculine perspective, which is 100% governed by the phallic function, the feminine subject is nothing more than a pile of parts, the possession of which helps him feel whole. And by whole here, as you well know, I mean autonomous. Yet another reason, it seems to me, that we should run this whole thing through the gyre of the master. Beneath the master's semblance of authority and autonomy, here is that S1, there is a lacking, inconsistent, and fundamentally insecure subject. There is your /S. A subject in search of a partner, S2, who will allow themselves to be reduced to a part. There's your little a part for his surplus enjoyment, and beyond it, phallic jouissance. Both of which promise that this is sure to be the part that will make him feel whole, thereby justifying all his claims of mastery, returning us thereby back to that S1 in the master's discourse. If you've ever wondered how the masculine fantasy of the exceptional man, the big dog, the tomcat, the father of the primal horde plays out, you need look no further. It's little more than a steaming, toxic puddle of narcissistic love, by which I, of course, mean precisely what Lacan means: hate. Narcissists don't just hate themselves. They hate themselves through others. Most of this, unfortunately, is lost on the masculine subject of phallic enjoyment, represented by that J phi in Lacan's newfangled Baromean drawing. And all the more so when they play master. You see, they become so laser-focused on the production and justification of authoritative claims, S1, that they fail to realize their reliance on language use, addressees, and part objects to make these claims in service to these goals. Which is why it's so hilarious to imagine the existence of a masculine subject who can naysay the phallic function. Here's the first formula of masculine enjoyment. There exists someone who can say no to the phallic function. And the reason why Lacan thinks this is hilarious, second only in hilarity to the joke of a sexual rapport, is because in order for you to naysay the phallic function, you have to go into it full bore, namely by resorting to language. You can't say no to language without making use of language. And as a result, even and especially when we say no to the phallus, we find ourselves right in its midst. In order to proclaim their authority, let me be clear. The masculinized master must first, even if only unwittingly, accept heteronomy instead. Hence, again, the barred fantasy in the lower half of the master's discourse. I say barred because there's no lozenge between that /S and the little a in the lower half of the master's discourse. Why is there no lozenge? Because the agent in this discourse, the would-be master, fails to see that he's just another lacking subject in search of something, anything, to help him feel full. And now, with that, you've got Lacan's basic formula for fantasy. /S lozenge A barred subject in search of something, anything, to feel whole. But you know what? I don't even think we need to go to these lengths to reveal this basic truth. In every claim of mastery, in every S1, we hear the same je suis, the same insistence that I am sure of being me, which Descartes gave us. I think, therefore je suis. I think, therefore I am me. The effects of the masculinized master's je suis, which is central to what's happening in Lacan's Third Rome discourse, are many, profound, and far-reaching. We could spend hours listing the effects of this je suis. It would amount to a rewriting of the history of Western thought, I expect, and we'd still come up short. That's the issue here. There's one effect of this je suis, though, that I think is really worth noting here, especially in light of the text that we're reading. It's the masculinized master's je suis that conditions the feminine subject's access to life's se jouit. That's the move that I think is at stake in Lacan's Third Rome discourse, around this poetic flit from je suis, I think, therefore I am me, to se jouit, I think, therefore it enjoys. It's the masculine subject's je suis that conditions the feminine subject's access to life's se jouit. You see? See how this is coming together? I think this is what Lacan is up to. Phallic enjoyment, he tells us just before this Rome discourse in Seminar 21. He says it's about how two bodies enjoy one another. That's his definition of phallic enjoyment. Here we might sum this up by saying, again, better than before, that in the phallic field, she is taught to enjoy being what he is taught to enjoy having, the phallus. But there's more to enjoy beyond this phallus, as you will know. The masculine subject denies it, however, but the feminine subject knows it to be true, and she knows it in her bones, in her body, encore with the space between the N and the C. I think it's here, in and as a body, that she also enjoys, beyond the phallic function that he cannot escape. At stake here is not another different way for two bodies to enjoy one another, but instead a way for one body to enjoy its self. That's what's at stake in the J, capital A. A way for a body to enjoy its self. And I think this is precisely what Lacan means by corporal enjoyment. Here, and again in Seminar 21, just before he delivers this lecture, he tells us corporal enjoyment is about how a body enjoys itself, se jouit, and he explicitly links it to feminine enjoyment. So why not be categorical with all of this? If phallic enjoyment is centered on the masculine je suis, the corporal enjoyment it empowers feminine subjects to cultivate has another French mantra, se jouit. His I am me allows her to enjoy herself. With an emphasis, I would say, on the word other you just heard me use. Which is why, again, we abbreviate it J capital A, just as Lacan does in his enhanced Baromean diagram. But don't let the poetry of je suis versus se jouit to blind you to their secret kinship, a kinship that masculine masters are often all too good at keeping secret, or so they tell themselves. Let's see if I can hit this nail on the head. The S1 with which masculine masters say, I am me, se jouit, it is in fact an S3. There are three signifiers not one, in his I am me. A subject, there's your I. A predicate, there's your me. And a copula between them, am. I am me. Hence Lacan's homophonic pun on Indo-European in his third Rome discourse. Did you catch this one? That's pretty funny. The master is at root, he suggests, an Indo-European, a 1-2 European, a 1-2 European. This is what it means to be Indo-European, he jokes. And wherever two have gathered in the form of this 1-2 European, never forget there's always already a third between them, without which you wouldn't have two at all. There'd be no and there'd be no du. I am me. Notice, with am, of course, coming from the universal Indo-European verb to be. Every Indo-European anchored language has a version of to be. It's universal in that sense. Hell, it might even be the closest thing we have to God, this copula, which is why I think Lacan quips, and I quote, "What's being got that's supreme, if not through this copula?" Okay, I hear you. Why am I pushing on all of this? Getting weirder and wilder with every turn here. Aren't we supposed to just be talking about sexuation as it finds itself in the new Baromean drawing? Why am I getting so wild and weird with this stuff? Because I think at root, this is what it means to count three. And counting three, Lacan says at this point, is essentially what it means to follow his teaching. To think like a Lacanian is to count three. Now, I know some of you have heard that to think like a Lacanian, you have to count to 4. Did you hear that from Lacan? If so, holler at me, let me know. Because what I read Lacan saying explicitly in Seminar 21 is that the magic number is in fact 3. Maybe there's a 4th Rome discourse that I somehow missed, and it could be called the 4th. I haven't seen it yet. If you've got it, damn, I'd love to check it out. The magic number for Lacan in the early to mid-1970s is 3, and he's explicit about this in Seminar 21. To count like a Lacanian is to count 3. Clearly, the feminine subject counts 3. Some, but not all. 1, 2, 3. But you got to be careful about this. I would count them instead like this: 1, 3, 2. There's the part of her enjoyment that's governed by the phallic function. Here's the sum we number 1. Marked in the diagram on your screen, little a. And then there's the part of her enjoyment that exceeds such governance. Here is the not all we number 2, and what we write on the screen, JA, just as you see it. But don't forget that disjunctive but between some and not all. It's a third element, irreducible to the other two, that prevents her enjoyment, and by extension her subjectivity, from ever becoming one. Some, not all, with a disjunctive but in between, that prevents her enjoyment and herself from ever becoming one. So when Lacan says, woman does not exist, I think this is what he's getting at. There is no such thing as a singular, coherent, unified woman. oneness is absolutely foreign to her. One part corporality, one part commodity, and one part non-rapport that is neither corporal nor commodified. That disjunctive but in between. She's never one without also being the other, and thus also a third, which functions as their irremediable division. Which means that for Lacan, the feminine subject is not all here, not all there, and not all everywhere. And I think this is the more profound insight into her not all. She is not all in the phallic field. Some, but not all, of her enjoyment is governed by the phallic function. But what that means is that she is not all exterior to the phallic field either. You might even say that some, but not all, of her enjoyment exceeds the symbolic, exceeds the phallic field. And what that means is that she is not all here in the phallic field, not all there in the imaginary real realm beyond the symbolic, and as a result, not all anywhere. But guess what? Here's the news. Here's the big news that some of us know all too well and that others can't bear to admit. The same shit is true of masculine subjects, and all the more so when they play master. Behind the oneness they proclaim is a triplicity that's apparent to everyone else. I am me. 1, 2, 3. Or again, as Lacan would count, 1, 3, 2. This I am me. What then, my friends, is the real difference between masculine and feminine subjectivity? You probably heard this one before, even as recently as a few minutes ago. The masculine subject is simply a feminine subject in denial. And my point in all of this, if I could have one here at the end of this lecture, is that it's time to come clean, my brothers. We are all at root feminine subjects.